This is Patricia Martin, and I'm your host for Jung and the World. Joining me today are Laura Tuley and John White. Laura Tuley is a Jungian psychoanalyst in private practice in Madison, Wisconsin. She is coordinator and a faculty member of the Jungian Seminar of New Orleans. Tuley has authored several important articles on depth psychology and brings Jungian thought to bear on contemporary culture and politics. John White was a philosophy professor for 20 years before training as a psychoanalyst. In addition to serving clients in private practice, he coordinates the analyst training program at the C.G. Jung Institute of Pittsburgh and is president of the Pittsburgh Psychoanalytic Center. They're here to talk about a recent collection of essays that they've curated that recasts the role of Jungian analysis in a time when our social excesses, gun violence, industrial farming, pollution, are bringing to bear trauma individually and collectively. Their book is entitled Jungian Analysis in a World on Fire at the Nexus of Individual and Collective Trauma. Welcome, John and Laura. It's great to have you on Jung and the World.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was really taken with the phrase World on Fire that's in the title. How did you come to that?
Well, I came up with the first part of the title and John came up with the second. World on Fire was definitely meant to evoke one of the central collective crises of our time, climate change. But it's also a metaphor for the heat created by the individual and collective psyche by a range of forms of political, cultural, and social upheaval that can feel apocalyptic at times. There were also actual fires ravaging California and I think Colorado as we were working on the book.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that well. I remember how surprised I was, but just kind of out of the blue, you suggested that as the title. And it seemed like it matched so well the way that we were thinking about it. And the only concern was that I didn't say exactly what the book was about. And so we added the subtitle there, at the Nexus of Individual and Collective Trauma.
It's interesting to hear your answer because I also felt that as I was reading the essays, even though they're on a variety of topics, that there was this growing sense that there is a heightened emotion that gets described in each essay is on a different theme, but there's this sense of rage, sort of a spectrum of rage to helplessness. But I think part of the book's message is that this level of emotional intensity is part of the fire.
Absolutely.
And so I want to talk a little bit, just at the top of this, about this bigger concept of how the individual's fire, their emotional intensity as the result of, this traumatic situation that we find ourselves in, bearing down on them, the power of their emotions, and then what's happening in the collective and how those two interact or intersect. Can you just explain the dynamic?
I don't think they are ever separate. The psyche of the person with whom we work reflects both their experience of the world and, from a Jungian perspective, their experience of the archetypal in the form of personal and or collective complexes. There's always a shuttling back and forth or commerce between the personal and the collective, or what we call the inner and the outer.
Yeah, as I've described it in the introduction, I described the individual psyche as sort of the sensorium of both individual and collective experiences. And I think, I don't know that Laura and I talked about this explicitly, there was this feeling just in the air over the last decade or so of both the feeling of the high value of certain things and the urgency of these things, which is really what's posing this emotional power that you're talking about. So it became clear to both of us, and I don't know if Laura would put it this way, but it came clear to both of us that when we're working with someone individually, we have to always keep in mind how that individual psyche is also not only influenced, but is really the bearer of some of that collective trauma and that collective emotion. So there's a way where the old-fashioned psychoanalytic view that you're doing individual therapy, and that it always has that individual index to it, is not entirely false, but it may also miss the fact that this individual and what they're suffering with right now is actually a bearing of a large collective value and large collective emotional traumas and distresses.
I'm just curious about how that shows up in the consulting room. In other words, are you seeing that people are bearing the weight of the trauma in the culture or in the collective, and then, it's overwhelming and it leads to a personal crisis? Or do they show up first with the personal crisis and then you have to unwind it?
In my experience, it's been both. Since 2016, but when I lived in New Orleans before I moved up here. So I moved up to Wisconsin in 2015. But prior to that, I worked with people after Hurricane Katrina, after the BP oil spill, through other kinds of collective issues, traumas that in Louisiana and the New Orleans area. But after I moved up here with the election of Donald Trump, with the pandemic, people have been extremely, and with climate change, of course, George Floyd, people have been really, really amped up about collective issues. Sometimes they come in to talk about personal symptoms, and it leads to dropping down into their feelings around politics or the environment. Sometimes they just come in with the wanting a sense of urgency and fear and anxiety, and sometimes depression around what's going on in the world, and hopelessness increasingly among younger people, I would say. What's more unusual, and actually which has become a kind of question mark, if not a red flag to me, is the patient who never talks about what's going on in the world, or a patient during the pandemic who says nothing about the pandemic.
What does that tell you? I'm just curious.
It can speak to a range of conditions, I think. I mean, I would say sometimes it's a trauma, someone who comes from trauma and is sort of calming down in the context of collective trauma, like there's a balancing out there. Sometimes it's just completely overwhelming, like too overwhelming to even metabolize on any level.
Yeah, I think that's right. And sometimes there's a strongly defensive quality. It seems to me that there are times when someone will come in and, I can just experience as soon as they're walking in the room, can feel the anxiety almost emanating from them, maybe like a fire. And but when they sit down, I don't know what I'm anxious about, and they can't pinpoint anything. And as a rule, I won't suggest anything more collective unless we've gone through all the individual things that it might be. But oftentimes when I do, there's this sudden disturbance and relief, that, yeah, this really is this. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's actually this. So it's almost as if people have become trained to think that whatever their internal experiences are really just internal and are really just theirs. In some cases, in fact, I'm not sure it's, as you put it earlier, a response to the thing. I think they're actually, like I say, bearing some of the collective burden. So it isn't only that they're responding to something that's disturbing them. It's as if there's a collective burden that everyone's carrying to some extent. And even that can be felt sometimes, even if it's often not articulated.
Like a psychic osmosis.
Yes.
You're soaking in it.
That's right.
Yes.
Yes. And I wonder also, if, because I've done this myself. I've unplugged for days at a time so that I can focus and not have to engage with headlines that let me know that California is burning, and there is still racial strife in the country that feels arcane compared to what I've lived through. Like there are so many things for my mind to try to make peace with that it can't, that I unplug for a while. And then you begin to have a sense of loss about that. Like you're out of touch, you're out of tune. So it's a difficult thing to calibrate. Like, how much do you consume, what's apparent? And I even see this in the political races. We don't talk about politics very much on this show, but it seems to have become a fight for people's attention. So it's become more and more performative and less substantive. So we're not really sure what anybody's going to do about any of this. They're just sort of trying to get our attention on it. And I guess I wonder, we've been in this, as you said, since, or maybe it's been that you've been paying attention to it, Laura, since 2016. Do you feel as if we are continually escalating in terms of this? Is it, or is this just what it is, and this is what we're in? How would you gauge the intensity?
I feel as if it's escalating in part because of how we receive our news, or how saturated we are by the news, particularly for those who pay a lot of attention to social media. And I tend to think it's more than we can, or our patients can metabolize most of the time, especially in light of the fact that there are limited actions we can take in response to what we're taking in, right? Whether it's about how the election cycle is spinning out, or about war in Gaza. I mean, there are things to be done, but we see more, we take in more than I think the psyche's able to, again, digest. But, when I look at history, I sometimes wonder if this is how people have often felt in different eras, and within the context of war, or famine, or plagues, etc. So I guess I kind of think it's both. This is more intense, perhaps because of climate change, and perhaps because of technology. But I'm not sure historically that is accurate.
Yeah, to me, it also has felt like it's more intense. I mean, I've monitored that actually for quite a long time, especially with people that I've worked with for a long time, and where they are in their individual lives, they're doing so much better, and yet this level of anxiety, sometimes, as you say, the level of depression, other kinds of things are weighing more heavily. I also think, though, that the kinds of affects, particularly that we're talking about here, tend to have a contagion. That's one of the important points here, I think. Like, for example, anxiety of the kind that's an anxiety about one's existence, existential anxiety about politics. And, sometimes people think we shouldn't get worked up about politics. I think politics is one of the things we ought to get worked up about, because it's about, how we live collectively together. So it always includes a certain amount of anxiety and a certain amount of anger. And but at the same time, those are feelings that by nature are contagious. And I do think that the addition of social media and 24-hour media of some kind, I think all of those things do intensify it. So although, I have no way of comparing this to 1920 or something, or 1924, I can still surmise at least that social media, the idea that we're frequently on screens, the idea that we're using media of all kinds, these media are very good at continuing the contagion. And that I think really shouldn't be lost on us. I really think that that's serious and severe. And in that respect, the so-called information age has not necessarily been entirely to our benefit, because I think it,
especially with algorithms that are feeding people, what they already believe or what they're already anxious about.
Yeah, so you get more and more of the same, and it does have a compounding effect.
Yes.
So I wonder, though, trauma is in your title, and because I track a lot of online behaviors myself, it's a fascination of mine that I'm watching this rising generation of young people who feel completely free to take trauma, for instance, personal trauma, and make that a public conversation. And, I came up in a generation where that was a private matter, and you sought analysis privately for that. And it's a big difference. Do you think that's helpful or hurtful, or are there aspects there that are a bit of both? That sort of the meme of trauma, and it's a big meme.
The meme of trauma. That phrasing in itself is kind of problematic, right? Or it says something about how trauma is being represented. I think it can be both. I think that the tendency towards confession confessional writing can be problematic and, increase the contagion, damage people's reputations, etc. I don't think it's always helpful to announce one's trauma or before one has had a chance to explore it or heal from it. On the other hand, as someone who feels like the personal is always on some level political, I think it can also open our eyes to phenomenon that we otherwise wouldn't readily accept. It can help people to feel less alone, more connected to community. It can facilitate change. So, I guess I think it's both.
Yeah.
I know I read the newspaper and I feel like I can always tell when the writer's a millennial writer, which maybe you will edit that out that I said that.
I'm intrigued.
I feel as if they're talking a lot about themselves. They're bringing in personal anecdotes. I mean, it's really interesting to me.
Yes, it is. The confessional mode is it's elevated to a genre almost, I would say.
Yeah.
I also wonder about this. I kind of want to shift the lens a little bit, because your book talks to analysts, the psychoanalytic community as well, about this business of what is personal and private versus what is public. And it's really a call to action in many ways for the profession to step into a more public role. Do I have that right?
Maybe in part. I think that we raise it as a question. We raise our role as a question. The focus is more clinically. What does this look like and how do we receive it? What do we do with it? What does it tell us about collective phenomenon? How do we take it in? How do we think about it in terms of Jung's map of the psyche? But I don't think that we are necessarily calling for action. I think we're raising a question about if and how it might be appropriate for an analyst to take a stance either inside or outside the container in some form. What would you say, John?
Yeah, I think that's on target. So it really was, I think, even when we talked about this volume earlier on, we weren't necessarily calling to action, but we were saying that was an implication here, that psychoanalysts have something to say about this, about what's going on. And that's not, psychoanalysis maybe doesn't have the status it had 100 years ago or 50 years ago, but there's something in the psychoanalytic community that maybe it needs to step up and show that it has some authority to speak on these issues, because all too often they're all kind of treated as like a set of external facts, rather than, yes, there are external facts, but they're things, as already Patricia, you pointed out, that there's emotional contagion. And whenever there's emotional contagion, and this is very important from Jung, is that emotions are, as a rule, are about value. Right? So feelings correlate to value. So when people are having strong feelings about something, it means that those feelings are telling you something about values and value conflict. And that's true clinically, and it's true also at a collective level. I might even add here that this is, maybe just my pet peeve, but, in the American historical tradition, one of the places where Puritanism still has a strong impact on us is a suspicion around emotions, or let's say a suspicion around anything that's not reason and freedom. That's it. Reason and will, that's all you got. And anything that's emotional, is kind of a problem, and you have to learn to regulate your emotions, as a lot of is often said in, contemporary psychotherapy. But that regulation always sounds to me like it's closer to repression, when in many cases people actually have to learn to respect their emotions more, because it's emotions that give you a value compass. Right. So if you're trying to understand the things that we're talking about, and we're trying to bring them up in terms of their value importance, the way that you originally experience something as having a high value is that it strikes you, that you're moved by it, that you're touched by it, that you have emotional experiences that are drawing your attention to the value or to the value conflict that's at stake. So a kind of puritanical repression of emotion, which I still think lurks in our history. And as often happens, the enantiodromia is just as bad, which is not so much, can be like raw emotions just exuding all over the place without anyone trying to connect it to a value. Neither of these are helpful, for trying to understand what these really mean psychologically and personally to us. So to learn to take values, to learn to take emotion seriously, to learn to cultivate emotion, so that your emotional life leads you to a whole realm of values. That's not something that we have any traditions that I know of, at least. And so that increases this problem.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the idea of our early roots as a nation, because that was also a theme that, it's a thread that runs through these essays, is that we were founded as a nation on a different premise than, let's say, Europe, right? European countries. And so it creates different psychological problems for Americans than that eke out into the collective, or vice versa. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Give me your thoughts from the book on examples where, what is at the root of that particular problem goes way back to our founding as a nation.
That's a big question.
Well, I was thinking, for instance, I was totally intrigued by the essay on guns and the gun complex.
Yeah. And that essay is such a good example of what you're talking about, because it is tracing back to a history where a certain American idealization of autonomy, being able to be your own person, included, especially think of the Western movement and the frontier movement and all of that. I mean, there's something kind of inherent to the value of a gun, and also to a person being able to operate that gun. And when you see so frequently, you can see, like, Jung has this idea that a complex is always something that has a kind of affective energy, but is also characterized by an image. Well, if you think of that and you bring it to a collective level, you often have the impression that the complexes are different, right? So if I say gun to one of my friends who is basically on the right of the political spectrum, the image that he'll have, I can just tell in the discourse, is one of a person who has precisely that old-fashioned autonomy, can run his own house, doesn't need someone to tell him what to do, has control of things, feels like he can protect and all of that. And many of my friends who are on the other side of the spectrum, they hear guns and they're thinking of victims. They're thinking of the, of the devastation that they've wrought. But what's so interesting here is that sort of the conceptual content is the same, but the image and the affective charge around them are opposite in some ways. They don't necessarily have to be opposite, but their experience is opposite to each other. So you have both this kind of history behind them, and then also that history, that thread of history that you're talking about. It also takes different forms at times, but it often poses the problem of the complex, where Jung says that when the complex is unconscious, it splits into opposite affects. And so a kind of splitting, a kind of cultural splitting goes on, so that the so-called two sides, I say so-called because I usually think there are many more sides than two to things, but the two sides trying to talk with each other, they actually are using the same language, but the image basis is entirely different. So the discourse is going past each other in one way or another.
Like on the one hand, independence, autonomy, the right of self-defense, the right to defend your property, versus a more community-oriented ethos, which values government in a different way. I think that essay is also about aggression in a sense, and developing what it would mean to develop a healthy relationship to the gun complex or one's aggression, rather than simply demonizing it. She is trying to, particularly in the case of her female case vignettes with female patients, she's trying to think about what it means to harness that energy constructively or fruitfully.
And that's a bigger theme of the whole book.
Yes.
Is how do we harness some of this energy so that maybe we could behave differently, within our communities, and so that, Jung was not big on control. I think you pointed that out, John, but there is a sense that the world on fire is raging out of control. We as a society are out of control. And I do think that one of the reasons people seek help for some of their anxieties is because feeling out of control is awful. Yeah. It's hard to live your life when you feel out of control all the time. So I'm curious to know, when you begin with an analysis, the awareness of some of these complexes that might be in play, do you begin to see a change in a person's affect as they begin to kind of come to grips with what had been repressed or ignored? I mean, can you actually see a sort of calming effect?
Sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes, yes. Not always, for sure. I mean, it's a long and deep process. But yes, sometimes as people start to integrate different energy or energies or complexes or parts of themselves, they're able to live in more fully than they were before. That's really the aim of analysis. But do we feel more agency? Yes, perhaps. But none of them ever will feel completely in control. I mean, part of the work is also grieving what we've lost and coming to terms with our limitations, which isn't particularly analytic. I mean, that's also good psychotherapy. So I would say yes, and not always.
Interesting. Well, the essay on industrial farming, to me, what was resonant in that essay is just how far removed we are from the land and our food. I mean, this is primal stuff, right? And I walked away from that essay feeling like not only conscious of how I eat and what I eat and the roots of that, but also beginning to wonder about community around that. Like, how do I foster community around food and land that is different than what we've got now? I just want to kick that around. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's my chapter, and
That's right.
yeah, and I think you can. I mean, part of that is also about grieving what we've lost and the destruction, and how, as John was saying earlier, people come in as kind of vectors of suffering around these particular themes. And we just need to sit with that and feel it and drop down into it with them. But there are concrete steps people can take to make changes as individuals and as part of the collective around what we eat, how we get our food, how it's harvested, how it's treated, how we decide what we decide to eat, what we purchase. We definitely in our little corners of the world have some say in all of that. There also need to be changes on the policy level, but in terms of helping to empower our patients, to the extent that we have these conversations, people can develop a different relationship to nature, and I think that a lot of people are hungry for that. Like that's one of the illnesses of our time, the way that we're split off from it.
Well, John, you use that word. By the way, I wrote that word down in my notebook of favorite new words, sensorium.
I'm glad I could help.
Good word.
Ooh, it was a good one.
Yeah.
And I thought,
well, I put in italics. It must be good.
Yeah, it caught my eye. But no, Laura's got a great point about that feeling of being disconnected from the things that are natural for us to be connected to, nature. And it's not just really about the sustenance, food alone. It's also because so much of Western literary tradition shows nature as a medium for having divine experiences, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I would just like to talk about that in terms of this contemporary moment that we're in. How does our grieving the loss of our relationship to things that are quite natural or should be quite natural, do you think that's affecting people's experience of the numinous?
I do. I definitely do. Yeah. I would say that in general, that to my mind, industrialization brought with it the idea that anything that we call nature is simply a resource. And even the language of resources, I mean, listen to what that language is suggesting that the value of something consists in how it serves what we want, what we do. So it's a wholly consumerist conception of what nature is. Contrast that with the literature that you're talking about, or the way that many of the ancient mystics would talk about it, or esotericists, alchemists. They all understood themselves to be philosophers of nature, because nature is what the book of nature, they would say, is where we read off what God's will is for us. Right? So that, which is not to say that we're wholly identical with nature, but even the way that we're different from nature, even that is illuminated. Right? So, and some of the great Christian mystics, St. Bonaventure, for example, you could say that there are two books. One is the book of Scripture and one is the book of nature. And when you link them together, you have the book of life. That's how it is that you would use Scripture to understand nature and nature to understand Scripture. It would be understood as actually a kind of totality together, that both are revelations of the divine. But if you think of nature simply as resources, I mean, this word resource really, when people like Teddy Roosevelt was using it, like he was trying to actually save nature, but just understand that it makes it all kind of its value is a relative value insofar as it serves us. You can even see this, I think, in what used to be called the personnel departments in the 1970s, now human resources, acting like that's better. To my ears, of course, it's worse. It's actually saying that again, your value consists in how you're at the service of someone else, namely the bosses in your corporation and so forth, right? So this word resources, I think there's a lot contained in that. It's one of those words that really merits a kind of rhetorical analysis and a little meditation, because it will tell you that it makes nature nothing but what it is to us. So if there's anything that destroys the sense of the numinous, it's saying that the value of this is only for us. The numinous means something that's wholly other to us that reveals itself. So its value is intrinsic, and we're the ones moved by it. That's what the numinous means, actually. And when Otto speaks about that, he always speaks about it as the wholly other is what the numinous is. But if you think that, well, this is only important as far as it serves me, it's possibly the strongest defense against having a numinous experience that you can have.
Well, and it's the framing of it too is a resource implies consumption of the resource. So if you're only consuming the resource, how does one have the experience of the sensorium out of that, right?
Right, exactly.
Consumption and objectification, exploitation. Yes. I mean, the whole, so much language that we use is about that, our dominion over or our use of nature versus language that would evoke a relationship to nature or a sense of awe in the face of nature.
Yeah, let alone love.
I was just thinking about the word livestock recently because I had read the word dead stock and I was a little disturbed by it. And I thought, oh, livestock. This is how we talk about animals, right? There's more and more research. Yes, it's about what we do in the face of otherness or how we relate to otherness within and without. But there's more and more research about how similar animal brains, all kinds of animal brains are to human brains, how similar their feelings are to ours. So there's a level of anthropo-denial that has happened in order for us to maintain, our dominion over the rest of creation. Not to get on a soapbox.
Well, but I think you're kind of encapsulating the book's major themes, is that there is a right sizing or a resizing of how human beings see themselves in the context of the world. That, that reframing could also bring us some peace. It could bring us, it could reduce the level of anxiety where we're just, now it's all happening to us rather than we are part of something. And we might have a little agency we didn't think we have. And it begins with how we see ourselves in the world.
Yeah, that's lovely. You put that very well. And it's like the way in which that we are kind of co-creators with nature rather than seeing nature as simply just this, fuel, fuel for the fire.
Right. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you both for being on Jung in the World.
Thank you, Patricia.
Oh, what a pleasure. And I enjoyed the book of essays entirely. I'm going to state the title again, and we will link to it. Jungian Analysis in a World on Fire at the Nexus of Individual and Collective Trauma. We were talking today with Laura Tuley and John White, who were the co-editors. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, live and self-study courses, archives, this podcast, our blog, or to find Jungian analysts near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2023 donors who gave at the contributor level or above. Barbara Anand, PhD in honor of Fred Maples, S.J., Uni Alcott, Judith and Eric Cooper, David Dalrymple, Mary Doherty, Full Bloom Lotus Center for Self-Awareness, Boris Matthews, Bruce G. and Mary A. Robert Family Foundation, Diane Sherwood, Lawrence C. Tingley, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, and the Blackbaud Giving Fund. You can support this podcast by making a donation at our website, jungchicago.org.